Well, good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to the Labriola Center today. And I'm really happy that we have Dr. Daniel Herman, a professor of history at Central Washington University, here to speak with us today. Before we begin the program, I'd like to thank a few people without whom this event would not be possible. First, I'd like to thank, of course, Dr. Donald Fixico, who first proposed the idea of the Labriola Center American Indian National Book Award, and the judging committee for the book award, which includes Professor Dr. Donald Fixico, and fellow judges, American Indian Studies Professor David Martinez, and Professor of History Katherine Osburn. I'd also like to thank the students who work in the Labriola Center: Jessica Antonio, Tamara Lee, Arlene Serrano, Stephen Robbins, Joaquin, and Madison Fulton, and special thanks, Joaquin Preston and Madison Fulton, and special thanks today to Teresa in the mailroom who helped to set up the room. And I'd also like to thank ASU Libraries Business Operations Manager Lily Johnson for all of her hard work on our behalf, and I would also like to thank University Librarian Sherry Schmidt for her continuous support of this event. I'd like to acknowledge University of Arizona Press Director Catherine Conrad is joining us from Tucson. So we're very pleased about that. Please help yourself. We have refreshments in the classroom. So if you haven't had a chance, or certainly after the interview, if you'd like to have some refreshments, they're right here in the classroom. So at this time, I would like to present Dr. Herman with the Labriola Center American Indian National Book Award for his book, Rim Country Exodus, A Story of Conquest, Renewal, and Race in the Making. Dr. Herman. Congratulations. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
Joyce, can we?
Oh, picture.
Can you do that again?
Yeah.
Wants a picture.
You're a little bit faster than I thought. So.
Sorry, you get out of the way.
All
All
right,
right,
so-
have you?
Thank you.
Maybe a little bit closer together. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, it's a new camera.
That's a pretty snazzy looking camera there.
Alright, so now we'll continue. We're going to turn the floor over to Dr. Herman and also Dr. Osborne, and they'll be discussing Dr. Herman's book today. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. We're here today with Dr. Herman to discuss his latest book, as Joyce mentioned, Rim County Exodus. I'm going to provide you a brief biography of Dr. Herman and then summarize the book for those of you who haven't read it. And then I'm going to ask him some questions about how he perceives the book's significance and his approach to research and writing. So hopefully we can all get some ideas about how to write an award-winning book. Daniel Herman is a hiker, at least in the summer, and an avid rock hound, as well as a fan of classic jazz. He's an Arizona native who took his PhD at the University of California at Berkeley in 1995. His research focuses on American cultural history, American Indian history, and the United States West. He is an award-winning teacher at Central Washington University and has held fellowships with several prestigious scholarly organizations, including the Mellon Foundation, the Smithsonian, and the Clements Center for Southwest Studies at SMU, which is where I hope to go someday. So I'll drop your name.
Sure.
Let them know that I know you.
Sure, they'd love to have you.
Dr. Herman has produced 3 books and numerous scholarly articles. His first, Hunting and the American Imagination, published in 2001, won the 2002 American Historical Society Pacific Coast Branch Book Prize. His second book, Hell on the Range, A Story of Honor, Conscience, and the American West, published in 2010, was chosen as the Pima County Library Southwestern Book of the Year. And his newest book, published in 2012 by University of Arizona Press, Rim County Exodus, is of course what we're going to be discussing today. Rim County Exodus examines the violent and incongruous history of Apaches, Yavapais, settlers, and Office of Indian Affairs agents in Arizona between 1864 and 1940. Herman's book tells the story of how Indians survived ethnic cleansing, which was followed in 1875 by a forced march to the San Carlos Reservation. But Herman's book goes beyond intercultural conflict. He tells the story of how thousands of Yavapai and Apaches fled the reservation and returned to their homelands in the late 19th century. There, they lived among settlers and helped to build a modern state in Arizona with dams, hydroelectricity, roads, and bridges. He also demonstrates how Indians and settlers quickly developed conventions for cooperation with one another. And he analyzes how they negotiated and contested racial hierarchy. Dr. Herman's work places Indian studies and African American studies in a dialogue with one another. By analyzing race as it was constructed and lived in the West, he argues that race was formulated not only through scientific discourses, but also through day-to-day interactions between Indians, agents, and settlers. He adroitly draws comparisons between the paternalism of antebellum slavery and the paternalism of Indian affairs. Herman's theoretical framework categorizes the behavior of his historical actors according to notions of honor, which he contrasts with a social system based on conscience. In this setting, settlers played the part of benevolent paternalists who uplifted Indians, while Indians learned how to maneuver in this new racial order. He concludes that Indians' negotiations with the forces of colonialism allowed them a small amount of freedom to preserve their culture, but that they purchased that freedom at the cost of increased paternalism and a hardening of racial caste over time. Rim County Exodus offers an important new perspective on the making of the West. We're going to look at 4 categories today: the historiographical significance of the work, his theoretical framework for his analysis, his research methods, and his advice to young scholars. Dr. Herman, I understand your work to make several important historiographical contributions to American Indian history. Your work explores Indian labor as part of the making of the modern state in the West. Could you discuss how your work complements other recent labor ethnohistory?
Right. Hello, everybody. And first of all, it's an honor to receive this award. And it's really wonderful that the Labriola is here. I was able to make use of it when I was doing the research for the book. Back when Patricia Edders was around, and God bless her, I didn't know her very well, but she sure was helpful to me. In terms of the historiography here, some of the books that actually you had mentioned to me that I might want to compare my books to deal with contested notions of race, especially in Texas and Oklahoma or Indian Territory and so forth. And actually, in some ways, are more complex than mine, and mine's plenty complex, but they add another dimension by looking at, this is particularly Neil Foley and David Chang, and then Catherine Benton-Cohen and Eric Meeks, and look at a variety of ethnic groups and how they interact and how they define themselves, and sometimes in opposition to one another. And so sometimes there is an attempt to claim whiteness among some groups and to therefore sort of marginalize other groups at their expense, but that's not, of course, the whole story. So I think what we all see is a hardening of racial attitudes in the early 20th century, and for different reasons, for very different reasons. I think Chang is looking at the Creeks in Indian Territory in Oklahoma, and he says he sees contestation within the Creek people, among the Creek people, a contestation over nationalism. And all this goes back, he traces it back to power, which power is land, essentially. Power has to be invested in land, or vice versa. And so to contest land is to contest power, essentially. And my book is really not about that. I mean, there is contestation for land. Apaches come back and Yavapais, and I'm more familiar with, in this case, the Dilsye, the Tonto Apache, as they were known to whites and still are. The Payson people still call themselves Tonto Apache. But the Camp Verde people, and I think the Payson people really call themselves Dilsye, and I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation, but that's the best I can do without more help from actual people who live there. But anyway, I look sometimes at land and the attempt to homestead in particular, and there were some attempts to homestead, and in some cases successful. But there were a lot of obstacles put in the way, and some deliberately, but for racial reasons. And so, to some extent, these people were a marginalized people because they couldn't own land, and they were forced into the role of wage labor. And that also is some parallel there with some of these other books. Is it's exploitation in part of a labor force that in early Arizona and throughout the early West, I think Indians became what some scholars call a colonized labor force. They were working for the colonizer. And that's certainly one way to look at it. But the other thing, maybe I'm carrying on too long.
No,
Okay.
no, continue.
The other thing that when these people work, and this again is in a lot of the recent scholarship that you and I sort of emailed about, but a lot of the recent scholarship suggests that American Indians weren't just exploited laborers, they just weren't proletarianized, that labor was working wages was an instrument of helping them protect their cultural sovereignty, their traditions, and to negotiate change the way they wanted to, rather than it being imposed, rather than change being imposed by BIA agents and by settlers and by state law. There was, through work, one could gain some autonomy and some resources and some respect from the white community that allowed one to protect community. And of course Willie Bower, you mentioned Willie Bower, and that's exactly where his book on the Round Valley Reservation and the peoples there is very similar theme, very, very similar theme.
Well, thank you. Could you talk for a moment to the audience about your the parallels you drew between relations of power among masters or overseers and slaves, and between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and agents? And why is it that you think that those comparisons are important? What do they tell us?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. So, okay, so I don't know, there's 2 graduate students out there, I think. I don't know, maybe more, but I'm not sure which of you are, but I know one of you is. But, I went to college in the 70s and early 80s, and the scholarship then was completely different, but not necessarily wrong. There was a lot of good scholarship, and I didn't really read anything on American Indians when I was in college. There wasn't offered. And so what I read about, though, quite a bit, was a burgeoning period of African American studies and history. So I read a lot of that material in college, and then also as a graduate student. And one book I came back to was Eugene Genovese's Roll, Jordan, Roll, which I thought was a classic. And some of these books were what made me an historian, because I loved them so much. They were so fascinating to me that I felt like I just wanted to go on with this. And that was one of the books. And so I came back to that because a lot of scholarship, we've gone a different direction. We've looked at now, especially for race relations in the West, we've understood it through the lens of colonialism, which of course is on the money, you know, was a colonial situation. But I thought to our detriment that we hadn't done some of the things that Southern historians had done in looking at sort of day-to-day negotiations between masters and subalterns. I don't know if I'm using subaltern quite appropriately, but masters and slaves in this case, which is what Genovese did. And so I thought, well, BIA agents were not so different from plantation masters. They were in a similar position of authority. They similarly needed to and desired to make Indians work as they perceived it. Of course, Indians worked, but the idea was they didn't work to the satisfaction of white people. It was a different kind of work. At least whites didn't understand it properly, maybe. But the point was to make these people into producers, into productive, hardworking, you know, kind of the classic American Jeffersonian producer. And so masters also made slaves. Slaveholders also made slaves do the same thing for different reasons, though. There's a different kind of paternalism here because with the case of masters and slaves were in a position of permanent subordination, at least from the master's point of view. The slave never had a chance to be anything but a slave. Whereas, of course, the BIA agents were at least ostensibly trying to lift Indians to the level of everybody else, assimilating them, making them productive in order to make them average American citizens, making them independent. So, but there were so many parallels. I just thought, well, especially to understand day-to-day relationships and the negotiations that occurred, I thought that Genovese had provided this brilliant model that most scholars had overlooked in looking at Indians in the West. So paternalism on the plantation was a system of trades. And the trade was, the master, of course, he's going to make you work, and he's going to use a whip to do it, and he's going to use worse than that on some occasions. But he's also going to give you little sort of gifts. He's going to maybe give you, might give somebody a new suit of clothes, which this is all in a book called Slave Counterpoint, looking at Virginia and North Carolina. That's where I'm taking this, and also Genovese. But he might give you certain freedoms. And one of the freedoms was religious, the freedom to go out in the fields and have your own religious services. And we won't watch, we masters won't watch you, you'll do what you want out there. And that allowed a certain what would you say, ideological freedom to have a specific slave religion which wasn't pro-slavery, which in other words was an assault, well not an assault, I don't want to say that, was a critique of slavery. And Indians had the same sort of arrangements where the BIA agents, is what I argue, would kind of, they wanted approval, just like planters. They really wanted the people's approval. They also were strict paternalists. And so they were a lot of people didn't like them, frankly. A lot of just Indians weren't going to like them. So, but they did try to do little things for people, little favors, little freedoms, offer little freedoms in return for respect. And so that allowed Indian peoples to have a little more liberty in a situation that was presumably going to be top down, where the BIA agent was simply going to impose his will. But not always, it didn't always happen. And in some cases, I've found that suggestive evidence, and I don't say this is conclusive by any means, but simply suggestive evidence that in some cases Indian peoples were able to use agents to actually protect their cultures and promote a communal sensibility that the agents were supposedly trying to eradicate, but in a way they were reaffirming it. So I just thought that was interesting, and I wanted to go back to some of the older scholarship and pull that into the mix of all the interesting new stuff, really valuable new stuff. I mean, we've just gone 1,000,000 miles since the day I was in college. The history has just gone 1,000,000 miles in terms of its understanding of race, especially, and American Indians, from where we started. But I still thought some of this older work deserved sort of to be explored again. So that's what I...
Well, there's a new move to bring the discourse of slavery, antebellum slavery, into conversation with what's going on with our studies of slavery in the Southwest. So I think those kinds of discussions are really fruitful. They really help us think about things in a fresh way.
Yeah, SMU is having that big conference down there on the two slaveries and how where they intersect and how they're different. So.
And our own Calvin Schimmerhorn is going to that. He's going to be presenting his work. He's actually, he has the office next door to mine, so he's a very, very brilliant scholar.
I'd like to go to that too. But
I know. That would be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, why don't we take a moment and sort of look at your theoretical framework and your categories of analysis. In your introduction, you distinguish between two categories of analysis: discourses of race and class, and social practices and emotive performance.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you make that distinction, and how does that help us understand what's going on in Arizona at this time?
That's where I felt like I was making two contributions to the historiography. One was to link some of the older and newer, actually, historiography of the American South and race relations in the South to race relations in the West, making some linkages I think that other historians have kind of missed, although some of the new stuff is actually making those links, as you kind of pointed out implicitly in what you chose to say, hey, how do you frame yourself against these guys? But beyond that, this idea of emotive performance, okay? And this is just kind of something that I'll have to admit to you that I'm still figuring this out. I don't know if this is really something, or if it's just kind of something that's interesting but won't pan out. But so emotive performance. So when I started writing this book, I was actually I was trying to write a large, sort of like what Catherine Benton Cohen did and Eric Meeks did. I was trying to write a large panoramic history with a lot of peoples and their relations in Arizona's rim country, not county, by the way. It's rim country.
Oh,
okay.
It is. Oh my gosh.
It's quite all right. It's a natural mistake to make, and I was trying to write this panoramic history, and of course, I ended up with more than one book. I, conceived it all originally as one book, but then I realized I really had very different books. But in the course of doing that, I was interested in this concept of honor. This is getting to a question I think you're going to ask. There's a big historiography, especially vis-a-vis the American South, on honor, and so honor, especially as a male sort of identity, you want to call it an identity, And it's in distinction to what developed in the North was, at least in the Northeast, among the middle class, was a sort of identity formulated around conscience. And so what's the difference? And honor means that you're going to be more physically assertive, or at least you have the threat of physical assertion, and even more verbally assertive perhaps, that you also are going to look to your community for validation of your status. Not necessarily, you don't want to necessarily uphold biblical rectitude. You're not beholden to the book and to the orders of God. You're beholden also to, how do I look in the eyes of my fellow men in my community? Well, I'm going to have to stand up and kind of fight, sometimes like a duel. For elites, it would be a duel. For common people, common whites, it would be a rough and tumble fight. Blacks too, by the way. Same thing. It turns out that blacks and whites sometimes fought one another without I mean, just fist fights, basically, rough and tumble wrestling kind of fights. But, and so honor was more than that. It was also assertive drinking, sort of gambling, on horse races, on card games, the willingness to put out something at stake, whether it be putting your eye at stake, because among the people in the frontier there was eye gouging. That was kind of a part of the wrestling, was to gouge out an eye, and or else putting a lot of money at stake, putting your farm at stake or whatever. But being willing to risk was part of honor. And all of that was rejected by the conscience culture that was centered in the North, but also was in the South. I don't want to say that it wasn't Southern too. It was. But it wasn't as strong there. It still had, there was this honor culture, it was sort of this contest that was going on, or I don't know what to call it really, but a mesh of the two. And so I took honor and applied it to the West. And that's when I came across this really interesting history. This guy is writing about France. William Reddy, this guy named William Reddy, is writing about France, and he's looking at the post-revolutionary period, and he's wondering why it is that among the middle class people, the bourgeoisie, as Marx would call them, suddenly they become duelers. They start taking up dueling on large numbers, and whereas it had just been the elites, they're just the aristocracy before the French Revolution, now it's sort of just people with money, but it's not necessarily aristocracy. And he says, well, there's an emotional regime at work, that there's their public performance of self becomes more important, and the shaming, and you can be publicly shamed in this, I don't know how to explain it exactly, but to resuscitate your image in the public sphere, you have to duel. You take up this old aristocratic practice. Anyway, he called it an emotional regime, meaning that it repeated itself. It was pretty static. It lasted for quite a long time, where men felt like they had to recover their honor through dueling. And so I said, I took that concept and I said, well, how does it play out in the West? And so I say that settlers, white settlers, especially the men, because of course it was heavily a male settler, original settlers were almost overwhelmingly male, and there were some women, but not very many, and they carried with them these ideas about honor, this kind of worldview, if you want to call it that. But I call it an emotional posture, meaning it's not that that was their worldview, like, they were often Christian and they had a, worldview might be capitalist, but yet they carried around an emotional posture that meant they were going to fight, they were going to kill Indians if they felt like they were just going to kill Indians, okay, they were genocidal essentially. But they were not going to just, they'd fight among one another, they had range wars, they had lynchings, they had lots of drinking, gambling was just routine, and so okay, well, look at that in relation to Indians, and Indians had some honor culture too. Apaches and Yavapai did, and they too gambled. In fact, it was very important to them. And they too drank. They didn't drink the white men's liquor until later, but they drank their own brews that go back who knows how far, but the brews made from corn or from mezcal. And they did drink to get drunk, although these brews were not high alcoholic content. They were very low alcoholic content. They only was like 2% alcohol, but the men would fast before they drink, and they drink in quantity because the idea was to achieve an altered state. And a lot of it was just being social, just like for any other, modern right group of people drinking. It's to socialize and get along with each other. But sometimes there were other things going on as well. So there's an honor culture among Indians, there's an honor culture among white settlers, and then women come in, larger and larger numbers, and by the turn of the century, you're getting a new emphasis on let's redeem ourselves, let's reform ourselves, among whites, let's not quarrel anymore, let's not drink, we're going to outlaw liquor. 1915, I think. 1915, Arizona outlaws liquor, becomes dry state. Outlaw gambling, that's even earlier. I think that's 07 when they outlaw gambling. They give women the vote. So there's more emphasis on sort of more, well, what do you say? There's more emphasis on treating women right. Sort of let's not have too much spousal abuse. And so all these facets of conscience become very powerful in settler culture, and they begin to identify Indians as the other who are still dedicated to these uncivilized practices that whites themselves once practiced, at least white males commonly. It was just part of the culture, part of the thinking, part of the mindset, part of the worldview, all those things. So what happens? Indians get marginalized again. They've been marginalized already to a great extent. Now they get marginalized in a new way, which is to say that they are sinners, essentially. They're not biologically terrible people that are bloodthirsty and they're going to kill us all, but they're sinners. They need reform. They're sinners in need of reform. They drink and they gamble and they do all these things. And so that was that was something. And I don't know I think I started out talking about emotive performance. And I still have to get back to that, but that's honor and conscience. Do you want me to go back to that?
No, yeah, and so when you talk about that, you talk about how there's historians are focusing on the discourse, on the written,
yes.
And the codes and all of that. But you look at behavior and performance.
Yeah, I felt like there's something missing from, and it's not missing. I mean, the historiography is coming around toward me, and maybe I made too much out of that. But I think some of the stuff you mentioned actually doesn't just look at discourse. But we took the discursive turn in the 80s and 90s, and we started to look at language and how social categories are formed through language, through associating, say, black people with laziness or with drinking maybe or something like that. And this is all a linguistic turn, and some races get feminized. They get identified with female traits and so forth, and females get identified maybe with racial traits and so on and so forth. But we took this linguistic turn, and we sort of got to the point, I think, where we thought that it's all language that's driving everything. It's all what people say, how we're getting at their understanding of the world, and they're creating that understanding. They're manufacturing it. Isn't they're also getting it from the cultural past, but they're also manufacturing it to suit themselves and give themselves power. And of course, it's whites who are in control of discourse to the extent that they control the written word. They're the ones that are going to publish newspapers and publish books and so forth. But it got to the point where I think we began to see just discourse was driving the whole thing. And so I thought, but what I found in these oral histories that I used, which is for the graduate students, I was going to talk about these oral histories, I was really lucky. I found this oral history collection, the Hauser Oral Histories, done in 1970 and 71. And this is when the Payson people, the Tonto Apache Nation, a very small piece of land, they have a little postage stamp up there, but they were looking for federal recognition in 70-71, and to accomplish that, they went out and did some oral history, interviewing settlers and Indians both to establish the fact that they had been there since day one, basically, since before the settlers arrived, and they had maintained a presence there all the way through the historical period since the conquest. And those oral histories were amazing. And that was like, for me, it's not, here we see race, it's not discourse, we're talking about actual human interactions on a day-to-day basis that create a racial dynamic in the end. And they are more static than I think scholars suggest. In other words, there was resistance, but there was also a kind of stability that developed, this kind of emotional regime, this kind of like trade-offs. The settlers would do favors, just like the agents would. Settlers would do favors for Indians, and Indians would do favors for settlers. And most of the favors involved working for very low wages. But there were other favors too. They would make them baskets and just give them as a gift, or they would go hunting for them at some times, and vice versa. Settlers would loan guns to the Indians who were denied that by state law. They couldn't get guns big enough to hunt deer. And there was mutual interest in one another's babies. Sometimes they'd help deliver babies. One another, the settlers gave Indians permission to use their schoolhouse for a curing rite. And so there was all interesting interplay between settlers and Indians that you could only find through this oral history. You would never see it if you thought that race was constructed in dime novels and, newspapers. I did look at the newspapers, and there is a racial discourse. I get into that in one chapter. But that wasn't really where I was really offering something new. Where I was offering something new was look at the day-to-day relationships that these people had. And how did they interact? And what emotions did they feel toward one another? What emotions did they feel? And how did those emotions sort of replicate patterns, create patterns, and create a kind of stability in that relationship? And this had to be, you look at it from the Indian point of view, and I think this had to be wow, we can actually go back, we can kind of construct our way of life that we had a little bit, and we're going to be in the margins, but we can do it, and we can interact with these people peacefully, and they're going to actually not be that bad to us as we thought. It's kind of, there's an advantage to it. You're also looking at people who have just been completely dispossessed from the very land where they have to go now ask permission to live. They have to go ask permission, and they don't always get it. And so it's got to be very deeply hurtful too. Although the Indians didn't overtly ever say such things. They tried not to. I think they didn't want to upset the whites there. And there was also, of course, don't talk about dead people and dead people who were killed in the wars. That was one of the taboos. But so emotional regime is a little more stable than I think discourse, and explains a little more when you're explaining how people's emotions you create patterns of emotional interaction, patterns that involve both. They involve both from the part of whites. Whites are grateful to Indians and respect them, but at the same time have contempt for them and want to reform them. And then Indians have loyalty to whites and respect for them, but also have this discontent and this sense of being wronged. Those coexist, and they kind of just get replicated for a while. Anyway, that's where I'll leave it. I probably talked too much. So.
Well, and I can see a parallel there with paternalism on the plantation. Mm-hmm. The whole idea that outwardly I will ingratiate myself to you, but inwardly exactly. I can protect myself
exactly.
from abuse.
Exactly.
Well, and I think that your discussion of the oral history then segued into the next question about how you put Native voices into this narrative and make sure that the Native perspective is privileged and honored.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't mean to suggest that, okay, so when I first gave a paper on this at the WHA, I didn't have a good reception, and I was hurt by that, but you know how it goes if you've ever given a conference paper and people don't love it. But it wasn't well thought through. I was just beginning to think of this stuff, and somebody said, well, did the Apaches really just accept this situation where they were essentially relegated to a lower caste? And I was saying, yeah, they kind of did because it was a trade. What they got was to protect their culture, and this was the trade they made. They engaged in paternalistic relationships because it was a useful tool to them to protect their culture. But they weren't seeking economic and political power the way an autonomous actor in a Western democracy would seek political power. They were seeking another kind of power, but it wasn't particularly that. But what I don't mean to suggest though is that they never did, or that they were ignorant of all this. They just fell into caste and they were just happy to be, the nigger, so to speak. No, I don't think that at all. But I think to some degree they did accept this, and they did have very human relationships with whites, and they did have loyalty to them, and vice versa. But at the same time, sure, there was a very deep reservoir of we are subjugated and we don't want to be. But I think that came out with the next generation. I argue, and I don't know if this is right or not. Again, I might be droning on. Should I jump up and down?
You could. Why don't you just wrap up by offering advice to those of us who are sitting there staring at Hollinger boxes? How do we, and what advice could you make about could you offer about making sense of all of this? I'm intrigued by the way you pulled all of these meanings out of the sources that you used, and you crafted this story with all these layers of analysis.
Yeah, so, yeah, and there are some layers there, and it was just like accretion. It was just becoming familiar with looking at the sources, and then I just started to see patterns, and then I became more familiar with some secondary literature, and that led me to another sort of layer of analysis. And I went into it with when I first became aware of the Hauser collections, that's actually the first thing that happened. I looked at those, and I didn't know what I was going to write about. And the Hauser things were really, really surprising to me, these relationships that developed. I was really surprised by that. And so then I started thinking in terms of, well, where's the theory? I mean, what am I supposed to pick out of this? This is interesting, but what do I make of it? And then I started thinking about Southern historiography. And so that layer was added to it. I began to view it in those terms. And that's what I was working on at the WHA when I first gave a paper on it. I was working on how is this similar to what happened in the South on plantations. And then there were other layers that were added to it about emotive performance and the tourist trade. I think I've got a lot of ways to go on that to fully understand that, but I hinted at some interactions in the tourist trade that were what I would consider part of a re-education campaign by American Indians. So it was exploitative, the tourist trade, but at the same time there were Indians who wanted to participate because they actually were part of a re-education campaign to formulate white minds. And whites were trying to educate them, but they were educating whites, in a sense, through the tourist trade. In a very non-verbal way. I don't think it was about discourse. I think it was about the act of buying and selling, of trading between whites and Indians. The act itself was an emotive performance, or something that, you can talk about it, but the feeling you get from it of who this other person is, that's something that I don't think necessarily can show up in discourse, at least not right away. But ultimately, I see the tourist trade as pretty important and not exploitative for sure, but only in part. And there's also a part of Indian agency there. But so, how do you front and center Indians? You find their voices. You can find their voices in BIA records. You can actually find a surprising amount. Fascinating stuff I didn't even put in the book. The thing I loved the most. And I wanted to actually bring a slide of it, but I wasn't going to do a PowerPoint. But I found a petition from San Carlos Apache, two different petitions in 1920-21, to the BIA agent saying, we want to practice Christian worship, but we want to do it ourselves. We don't want the missionaries there. We want to do it ourselves. And a lot of these people petitioning were Delzier, and there were others too. There were Pinel or San Carlos Apaches, I guess that's the broader term, but they were petitioning to basically have their own religion, but it was Christian, but do it on their own way. And they were very explicit about this, that it's not like the missionary Christianity. They've worked with us and so forth, but they really they're not doing the job. And so we want to do it ourselves. And they were having several hundred people come to these meetings. And I don't know whether the agent said yes or no, I assume yes, but these are Indian voices. And they come through in the BIA records. There's constant letters to the BIA, to the agents. There's just hundreds of them, mostly for petty things like, can you see to it that the Indian school accommodates me for the annual alumni dance, or something like that. But these are very revealing, and so I think you can find the Indian voice in the BIA records, even though yes, it's a top-down agency, but the voices are there. And you can also find them in the oral history if you're lucky enough to have one like I had. But I think there must be more of those out there. There must be. And I think that we need to understand, we're beginning to, some of this other literature that Katherine mentioned in her email does look at relations between Indians, whites, and Mexican Americans or Latinos, and other groups as well. We're beginning to look at that, but I think more can be done. And I think it's just opening up a lot of fascinating stuff.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your writing process with us, Dr. Herman. And are there any questions from the audience? Does anybody have anything they want to ask Dr. Herman?
I've got a question.
Okay.
And since we have Catherine Conrad in the audience, I'd like to ask her a question, but ask her about the relationship of the press with the author.
I'd like to hear what Ted says about that too, but there is from the time an author first, meets with an acquiring editor, and there becomes a really strong connection. And I can say specifically about this book, your editor, Kristen Buckles, was this tremendous advocate for this book through the entire process. And it was one of those books that from the very beginning, she came to the committee, the publications committee, with this tremendous enthusiasm. She said, we have something new here. And it's a lot about exactly what you're talking about, these layers that we don't see in everything.
Well, yeah, I mean, I could see that. Kristen was really supportive, and I really wanted to publish with Arizona Press because I grew up here, and it's like not the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to just determine who's the best press for my book, who's going to get. And I didn't really look at that information. I just wanted it to be an Arizona book, and so I approached Kristen first, and then I worked up her proposal. She was interested, so I worked up her proposal. And I think the fact that I had Hell on the Range, the counterpart to this book, already in process helped me a lot get in the door at U of A Press. And there was a lot of back and forth. My tendency is to really be annoying with an editor. And so I end up sending a lot of emails and, and they're pretty, sometimes they're kind of petty. And they get annoyed with me. But Kristen was really good about, just really good about fielding my questions and answering them. And there was, it was the usual press-author relationship, and they sent it out for the peer evaluations, and they came back positive, but boy, did they want some changes. And so I accommodated them. Only on the second round, they sent it out for 2 rounds of peer evaluation, once in the proposal stage when I just had, I think, a couple of chapters, and then they sent it out again when it was done. And both times they wanted really pretty major structural changes, and I made them. I resisted because I'm bullheaded, but I finally made them. And the book is much better for that. It was a fairly traditional press-author relationship, I think, except for Kristen was hugely supportive. And they're just incredibly easy to work with. And I wanted to have a lot of artwork in the book, and I did kind of fight for that a little bit. I don't know, I didn't have to fight very hard, but Kristen was concerned about the length. And that seems like every press in the world now, they really want you to write a 150-page book. Because that's what people read. They're not going to read it if it's too long, especially if it's scholarly. And I said I was going to write a short book, and then it ended up being a lot longer than I expected it to be. And plus all the images added to the link, and I used, I think, 45 images in there, plus maps. So it really added to the bulk of the book. And so that was something I had to negotiate, and but she caved, basically.
They're great pictures in the book.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I would just want to say that my argument about this is in contradiction to Jeff Shepard, and you guys probably know Jeff Shepard, who he is, but what I see, the activists who at first the Apaches and Yavapai they're willing to accept paternalism because it protects their culture to a certain extent. They can be themselves, and they can, especially if they flee the reservation, right? But it's the people who went to boarding school who become the real activists on the res, maybe not off it, maybe off it too, I'm not sure about that, but certainly on the res, they become, and I don't know that that's true in the Wallapai case, because Jeff's people are actually not, I don't think they're necessarily boarding school educated, but the boarding school people, I think they felt shamed by the boarding school experience because it was so tough and unforgiving in a way. And I think they were the more eager to take power from the BIA if they could, and they did. They set the San Carlos people and Camp Verde as well on the road to sovereignty, and they accepted the BIA wholeheartedly. They really pushed for the BIA. And unlike the Navajo, didn't want the sorry, what did I say? The IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act. The Navajos didn't vote for it, but the Apaches overwhelmingly supported it. And same with both Camp Verde, the little res at Camp Verde, and then the big one at San Carlos. And that was these boarding school educated people who were really organizing this. We got to have this. We need this for self-government. Because we realize that the power of paternalism, no matter how good the agent is, the agents were, I think Kitch was pretty good in his way. But it's still colonial because it's still a master relationship. He's still handing out the favors. And if he's handing out the favors, then he's got the power. It's the white guy in power. It's the BIA in power. And to have true sovereignty, we have to do that ourselves. We have to have our own government. And that's what the boarding school people did, and the day school people too, to a certain extent. So that was my argument. I don't know if it'll hold up for other reservations, but that's where the activism comes in. And then I also argue that selling baskets was actually an act of activism. And that may be forced. I don't know. They're going to be. I figured that's what I'm going to get slammed for in the reviews, but we'll see. But there's a lot of other scholarship that I didn't take into account, unfortunately. One of my flaws I didn't take into account. There are a couple of books I should have looked at closely and considered and compared my findings to theirs. But
you can't read everything. You'd
No.
never get anything out
I
if you
know.
did that.
It's absolutely true. Yeah.
I argue the same thing about Choctaw women and baskets, so they'll shoot us both down if they.
Your work actually. That's something I should have taken into consideration. I didn't know about your work, honestly. So now I do. But yeah.
Well, good. Now you know.
Yeah.
Well, any other questions? Everybody wants to get in there and get to eating on that delicious food, I think. So.
The images you have in the book, were they the images you wanted to use? Were you able to get permission for the images you wanted to use in the
I
book?
did. Yeah, I had a lot more that I wanted to use too, but I got the ones that I really wanted. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I found a great one of Charlie Naki. That was my prize. That was just like I read about this guy, Charlie Naki, probably, and I finally found an image of him, and I loved it anyway.
I was just curious, have you incorporated the works of like Timothy Bratz as well as Caroline Butler's recent work on oral history of the Yavapai?
I had not looked at Caroline Butler's work at all. I wasn't aware of it, in fact. And it may be, most of this book got written in 06, 07, 08, and it didn't actually come to press until later, and so a lot of the work that's between there and now I didn't include. Bratz, of course. Yeah, Bratz all the way. Bratz actually reviewed the book for me. He read the manuscript and critiqued it. And what I wanted to do that Bratz didn't do is Bratz had the whole history of conquest and survival, but he didn't really carry the story through the reservation era, the colonial and post-colonial era. And I wanted to carry that story farther. So that's what I tried to do. Now the oral history would have been, I'm sure, hugely valuable. I didn't put as much emphasis on Yavapais as on Apaches because I had more materials for the Apache, and I already had a long book. So good question, thank you.
Do you talk about the relationship between the Yavapais and Apaches? Do you go in more
Sure. That's something I think Bratz kind of minimized. He talks about it, but I think not enough. I mean, they were a very kindred people, closely related, mixed bands. A lot of them were in mixed bands in the Matazal, and then also in the Verde Valley and up around the Red Rocks, and those were mixed bands. They were bilingual. They spoke both languages. Of course, if you were born to an Apache mother, you were a part of an Apache clan, but Yavapais didn't have clans. So if you were born to a Yavapai mother, you didn't have that, but you had some relationship through your father. They were often allied, and in these mixed bands, obviously they were allied, and very interesting people insofar as they were bilingual, and it's just not the way we think of Indian peoples, and that goes back to, I guess, a lesson that Sasha Harman taught us, is that whites defined Indians as much as Indians defined Indians, and we thought of them as just, they were this tribe or they were that tribe, and Indians didn't necessarily think of themselves that way, and certainly in this case. And yeah, there was friction between Yavapai and Apache because there were different Yavapai groups, and some of those were in tension with Apache. So they had a kind of, broadly speaking, they were allied, but underlying that alliance was a tension that was greatly exacerbated during conquest when Crook went out and recruited Yavapai scouts to hunt down certain Apache and other Yavapais, and Apache scouts to do the same. That, I think, really created a a boatload of friction that was resolved later. I mean, pretty bitterly in some cases. But the Yavapai, I think, and this may be wrong, and somebody could set me straight on this, but I think they've actually become more separate since Camp Verde was created in 07, since the conquest, really. In some ways, their identity has gone separate ways more than it was before, I think. So, yeah, I hope that helps answer your question.
Other questions?
Do you have insight into that you could share with me?
Well, I was actually going to do my master thesis on the Yavapai knowledge. I grew up on Fort McDowell, but I'm not a tribal member. But just looking at it and kind of considering the works of Caroline Butler's, it was almost like, to me, they put the Yavapais there in San Carlos to kind of teach the Apaches how to be more sedentary and to teach them how to farm. And so I was seeing if you kind of looked at that relationship between them.
Well, they did say that. Like, I think what I came across, and I'm sure it's not the whole of the evidence, but what I came across is that Crook and other generals said to the Yavapai, if you'll be a good example at San Carlos, we'll let you go home to the Verde Valley, not Fort McDowell, but to the Verde Valley. But I think they were saying the same thing to the Dilsier, that if you be a good example, then you can go home, and that's your reward for being a good people. But that's an interesting idea of setting up sort of one group as the exemplary group, and then the others as the ones that need the help and so forth. I think they were both in that role, but I don't know that much about it. I think it's certainly something to explore. It sounds like something really worth it.
And also considering the fact that when I was reading, I think it was Timothy Bratt's works, how he talked about the Yavapai did not want to go back to San Carlos at all. The reason they didn't become so dependent on the BIA and for government funding was because they feared going back. Oh, they're not adequate enough, or they're not sustainable enough in the Verde Valley, so let's send them back up to San Carlos.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Just considering that too. Also looking at Fort McDowell and how they are now, and looking at the different families that live there, and how much Apache they are, and how a lot of them go back and forth to San Carlos, even Camp Verde, to Fort McDowell. So seeing those relationships there is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So they had family in San Carlos, a lot of people at McDowell?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I figured that was true, but when Timothy Bratz and I were corresponding, he said, I said that I thought some of the Yavapai, I know that most of them left San Carlos, and they left in like 1890s, most of them. But I thought some stayed, even right into the 1940s. And I think Mike Burns, I think he was at San Carlos until he died, I think. Was he at Fort McDowell, or was he at?
Mike Burns, I think he was one of the people Caroline Butler interviews in their book, which was based on Fort McDowell.
Okay.
So, but I'm not too sure if he.
Okay. Well, I just thought that some of them stayed. So, I mean, it would explain if they had relatives, and they might have been Yavapai or Apache relatives. That would explain that there was some presence at San Carlos even after most of them had left. But I don't know. Great stuff for research. I think there's going to be a lot there.
Yeah.
David, did you have a question? I thought I saw you.
I wanted to begin by apologizing for arriving late. I had this event down for 1 o'clock, and so that's why I just walked through the door.
For a week from today.
I'll be back a week from today too, I'm sure. And so, in light of the fact that I'm tardy, hopefully my question isn't redundant, but I was curious about how you develop the native voice in your work, particularly with people regarding Delche or Mike Burns. I'm asking because the native voice in scholarship today is very important. At the same time, I'm aware that when it comes to historic figures, that it's not that easy to resurrect that voice, despite our best intentions at putting it into our narrative. And so I wanted to learn more about how you do that.
Well, and that's, I partly answered that question before about what you're talking about brings up a better answer, or partly a more full answer. I was just lucky. I had Mike Burns, and that rich autobiography that he wrote, which I just had the facsimile version, which is a mess because it somehow got disorganized. At some point, somebody rifled through it and disorganized the whole thing. And so apparently he had more than one draft. And so there's some replication of material because he was working on a new draft at certain points. But all that got, anyway, it's like 700 pages of manuscript that's all mixed up. And so I had that to work with. But the voice was there again and again, because what's interesting about Burns is that he tells the story of the conquest from the Yavapai point of view. And how could he do that? Because he was I think he was like 6 or 7 when he was captured. It was during the Indian Wars. He was just a little boy. And so obviously he had some stories from his parents, and he knew some stories about what was happening. But I think all the stuff that he says in that book, he couldn't have known when he was 6. He learned that later at San Carlos. People talked to him at San Carlos and told him, here's what happened to us. This is our experience. We were just out there, getting some mezcal, and we were attacked by the troops. We didn't do anything. We were just out there getting the mezcal, and here come the troops, and they killed a bunch of people, and and again and again, he has these stories again and again and again. And I think that he was kind of an oral historian. I think he was collecting those stories at San Carlos, and then he put them down in his memoir. He didn't say, I learned this at San Carlos, but I think he did. And so I had Indian voices from Mike Burns, and I really could have used more of them, to be quite honest. When I read, Greg McNamee just published a book, Burns's autobiography, and he boiled it down. He left out a lot of really important stuff, I'll tell you that. I thought he left out some really important stuff, but he boiled it down to a little book because that'll sell. That's what your press wanted. So, and I love the book, by the way. I really raved about it in a review, but he did leave out some important stuff. But I realized when I read that book that, oh my gosh, there was so much more of the Indian voice I could have used from Burns. And then more of the Indian voice, so I did use that. And then Delche, Tim Bratz missed a little bit of this when he talked about Delche, but there was more in Burns' story about Delche, and so I got some of Delche out of Burns. And so that was really helpful, to see these people as people, and not just through government records, not just records of the conquerors. So Burns is I think his autobiography is a classic. I'm actually having my survey students read it now, even though, I feel like it's a little out of place because it's Arizona, they're up in Washington, and, but I feel like that's such a great memoir that it's such a classic that it's going to be a classic that I'm going to have my students read it and discuss it at the lower division level. But yeah, and then I just looked for, as I was saying, I looked for the Indian voice in the BIA records, the petitions, the letters, all the things that came to the agent from Indian people. I used those a lot, and then I had these wonderful oral histories done with both Indians and settlers in 1970-71. They interviewed all the elderly people, all the elderly settlers and Indians, and so I had wonderful material to work with from that too. And so those are the 3 things that allowed me to use the Indian voice, I thought, anyway, pretty, fairly well. Well, I probably just, this is what I do. I was telling Katherine that I do go on, and so what I do in my classes is I get up, or I stop, I shut up, and then I throw things at people, and I do various things so that they'll continue to listen to me. But it's not appropriate here. So.
Yeah, it's always appropriate to fling things at undergraduates. All right, well, if any of you would like to visit some more with Dr. Herman, we're going to, what's the word I want? Retire, I guess, to the classroom, and there's chocolate in there, so it's time that we go in there and eat it. Thank you so much.